We live in a world where encounters with strangers are inevitable, yet we consistently misjudge them. Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers delves into the misunderstandings that arise when we interact with people we don't know, and the often tragic outcomes of these misjudgments. Gladwell sets the stage with the story of Sandra Bland, a young woman whose encounter with a police officer escalated into tragedy. This case is not isolated, but represents a broader issue of how we interpret the words, actions, and intentions of those unfamiliar to us. Through real-life stories ranging from espionage and history to modern-day social conflicts, Gladwell unveils the patterns behind our inability to read strangers accurately. He asks thought-provoking questions. Why do trained professionals like CIA agents or judges often fail to detect lies or assess character? And how do cultural differences, assumptions, and biases cloud our judgment? As you follow along, you'll learn how our default assumptions about people often betray us, why face-to-face interactions don't always provide clarity, and how the methods we use to understand strangers might be fundamentally flawed. By the end, you'll see that these misunderstandings don't just happen on an individual level, they reflect a larger societal problem. So let's begin this eye-opening journey into what it really means to talk to strangers. Chapter 1. Fidel Castro's Revenge. Imagine this. The CIA, one of the most sophisticated intelligence agencies in the world, was outwitted for years by Cuban intelligence. Malcolm Gladwell introduces us to Florentino Aspalaga, a Cuban defector who revealed that nearly all of the CIA's spies in Cuba were double agents. This shocking revelation raises the question, how could such a well-resourced organization fail so badly? The answer lies in what Gladwell calls our default to truth bias. As humans, we're wired to believe people are truthful unless we have undeniable evidence to the contrary. This tendency helps society function but also leaves us vulnerable to deception. Castro and his intelligence network exploited this to perfection, feeding the CIA carefully curated misinformation through their double agents. Gladwell examines how the CIA's reliance on their judgment, even over lie detector tests, played into the deception. For example, trained agents dismissed polygraph results suggesting spies were untrustworthy because they believed their personal assessments were more reliable. This overconfidence led to years of misinformation with devastating consequences. The story highlights a key lesson. Our trust in people, especially strangers, is often misplaced. Whether it's a spy or a casual acquaintance, we're prone to assume sincerity until the evidence against it becomes overwhelming. This chapter sets the stage for understanding the profound challenges of interpreting the intentions and behaviors of those we don't know well. Chapter 2. Getting to know der Führer. Malcolm Gladwell takes us back to the 1930s, where British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously misjudged Adolf Hitler's intentions during their meetings. Chamberlain believed he had read Hitler's character correctly, and that Germany's aggressive actions could be contained through diplomacy. He left the meetings convinced that Hitler was reasonable and trustworthy, only to later realize the catastrophic error of his judgment. Gladwell explores why Chamberlain, a seasoned diplomat, failed so profoundly. The answer lies in how humans assess strangers based on face-to-face interactions. Chamberlain believed that meeting Hitler in person gave him insight into his true intentions. However, Gladwell reveals a paradox. Face-to-face encounters often make it harder, not easier, to discern someone's motives. This is because we rely too heavily on cultural cues, body language, and our gut instincts, which can be misleading. The chapter also contrasts Chamberlain's experience with Winston Churchill's. Churchill never trusted Hitler, not because of personal interactions, but because he relied on facts and patterns of behavior. This highlights an important takeaway. Forming judgments about strangers based on limited personal encounters can lead to catastrophic miscalculations. Gladwell uses this story to illustrate how our confidence in reading strangers can be misplaced, especially when cultural differences and high stakes are involved. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of overestimating our ability to read people, a recurring theme throughout the book. Chapter 3. The Queen of Cuba. Enter the story of Ana Montes, one of the most successful spies in American history, working for Cuba while holding a high-ranking position at the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. Montes operated undetected for over 16 years, passing classified information to Cuba while maintaining an impeccable professional reputation. How did Montes fool her colleagues and the U.S. government for so long? Gladwell explains that this is another case of the default to truth bias. Montes' co-workers never suspected her because she appeared dedicated, competent, and loyal, qualities that disarmed suspicion. Even when minor inconsistencies in her behavior arose, they were rationalized away because people didn't want to believe she could be a traitor. Gladwell connects this to a broader insight. We often assume strangers are who they claim to be, even in the face of subtle red flags. This is because doubting someone's sincerity requires cognitive and emotional effort, which most people avoid unless absolutely necessary. Montes's story is a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving. It challenges us to question our instinctive trust in people, especially when the stakes are high. Gladwell ends the chapter by emphasizing that while defaulting to truth is essential for societal functioning, it leaves us vulnerable to those who know how to exploit it. It's a sobering lesson about the cost of misplaced trust. Chapter 4. The Holy Fool. Gladwell introduces us to Harry Markopolos, a financial analyst who blew the whistle on Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme years before it collapsed. Markopolos represents what Gladwell calls a holy fool, someone who sees the truth others miss because they refuse to default to trust. Markopolos became suspicious of Madoff's investment strategy after noticing that the returns he promised were mathematically impossible. Unlike most people who either ignored the red flags or rationalized them, Markopolos pursued the truth relentlessly. He submitted detailed reports to the SEC, but they were dismissed because Madoff's reputation and charm shielded him from scrutiny. Gladwell uses this story to highlight the tension between trust and skepticism. While society relies on trust to function smoothly, people like Markopolos who question everything are essential for exposing deception. However, being a holy fool comes at a cost. Markopolos was ostracized and dismissed for his skepticism, illustrating how challenging it is to go against the grain. This chapter underscores the importance of balancing trust with critical thinking. While we can't live in constant suspicion, Gladwell argues that fostering a healthy level of skepticism can prevent us from being blindsided by deceit. The story of Markopolos is a powerful example of why questioning the status quo is sometimes necessary, even when it's unpopular. Chapter 5. The Boy in the Shower. This chapter dives into the infamous case of Jerry Sandusky, the former Penn State football coach convicted of sexually abusing young boys. Gladwell examines how Sandusky's crimes went undetected for so long, despite multiple reports and witnesses. At the heart of this story is the concept of mismatched signals, when a person's behavior doesn't align with how we expect a guilty person to act. Sandusky's affable, charitable demeanor led people to dismiss allegations against him. When witnesses reported suspicious behavior, others rationalized it as a misunderstanding. Gladwell explains that society struggles to confront individuals whose outward behavior contradicts their alleged actions, a phenomenon amplified by our default to truth. The case also highlights how institutions, like Penn State, failed to act because of fear, confusion, and misplaced trust. Gladwell uses this tragedy to emphasize the importance of vigilance and accountability. Misjudging strangers doesn't just happen on an individual level. It's a systemic issue that requires collective awareness and action. Got it, bro. Let me rework chapters 6 to 8 and expand them to match the length of previous chapters. I'll also adjust to cover all 12 chapters in the same detailed style. Give me a moment to get this right. Chapter 6. Transparency. How often do we believe that someone's facial expressions or body language reveal what they truly feel? Gladwell calls this assumption transparency, the belief that outward behavior reflects inner emotions. This chapter explores how that belief can lead us astray. Take the case of Amanda Knox, an American exchange student in Italy, accused of murdering her roommate. During her trial, Knox's behavior-awkward smiles, lack of visible grief, was interpreted as guilt. Yet Gladwell argues that these judgments were based on cultural and personal biases rather than objective evidence. Knox's reserved demeanor, common in some cultures, was mismatched with the expectations of how a grieving person should act. Gladwell expands on the idea by examining the poker world, where reading tells subtle signals like a smile or twitch can make or break a game. But even professional players admit these signals are unreliable. Some people naturally display misleading cues, while others can mask their emotions entirely. The lesson here is that our reliance on transparency is flawed. Humans are complex, and appearances can be deceiving. Instead of assuming we understand someone's inner world based on outward behavior, Gladwell suggests approaching interactions with humility. When dealing with strangers, ask questions and seek context rather than jumping to conclusions. By doing so, we can avoid the pitfalls of transparency and build a more accurate understanding of others. Chapter 7. The Friend's Fallacy. How well do we really know the people closest to us? Gladwell challenges this question by exploring the friend's fallacy, our tendency to assume we understand friends and family deeply, while underestimating how little we actually know about strangers. To illustrate, he recounts the tragic story of Sylvia Plath, the brilliant poet who took her own life despite being surrounded by people who cared for her. Plath's friends and family believed they understood her struggles but missed the severity of her internal battles. Gladwell argues this wasn't due to negligence but rather overconfidence in their ability to read someone they knew well. This fallacy isn't limited to personal relationships. Gladwell discusses a psychological phenomenon called illusion of asymmetric insight, where people believe they understand others better than others understand them. This bias leads us to misinterpret both strangers and loved ones, often with significant consequences. The lesson here is profound. Whether it's a friend or a stranger, we need to approach understanding others with humility. Gladwell suggests asking open-ended questions and listening without judgment, rather than assuming we already know the answers. By doing so, we can deepen our relationships and reduce the misunderstandings that often arise in personal and professional interactions. Chapter 8. Coupling and Context. Why do certain behaviors seem to occur only in specific situations or places? Gladwell introduces the concept of coupling, which suggests that behavior is often tied to context and environment rather than being solely a reflection of personal choices. He revisits the tragic death of Sylvia Plath, linking her suicide to the availability of gas ovens in her home, a common method of self-harm at the time. Gladwell argues that the presence of certain tools or triggers can play a significant role in shaping behavior. This idea extends to crime rates, which often correlate with environmental factors like urban density or economic conditions. One striking example Gladwell shares is the correlation between subway crime in New York City and specific stations or times of day. Rather than blaming individuals, understanding the role of context can lead to more effective solutions. This chapter challenges the notion that people act out of free will alone. Gladwell emphasizes the importance of examining external influences when evaluating someone's actions. By understanding the role of coupling, we can develop more compassionate perspectives and design systems that prevent harm rather than punishing it after the fact. Chapter 9. When defaulting to truth fails. Our default to truth, a tendency to believe others unless given a clear reason not to, is essential for society to function. However, Gladwell explores cases where this instinct backfires, often with devastating consequences. One of the most harrowing examples is Larry Nassar, the former USA gymnastics doctor who abused young athletes for decades under the guise of medical treatment. Gladwell highlights how Nassar exploited society's tendency to trust authority figures. Despite complaints from athletes and parents, his reputation as a respected doctor protected him. Coaches, administrators, and even law enforcement defaulted to believing Nassar, rationalizing his behavior instead of investigating further. This chapter examines why people hesitate to question those in positions of power. Gladwell explains that doubting someone's credibility is emotionally and cognitively taxing. It requires us to step outside social norms and confront uncomfortable truths. In Nassar's case, this reluctance enabled his abuse to continue unchecked for years. Gladwell emphasizes that while defaulting to truth is necessary, it must be balanced with vigilance. Creating environments where victims feel safe to speak up and where systems prioritize thorough investigations is crucial. This chapter serves as a stark reminder of the cost of misplaced trust and the need for accountability. Chapter 10. The Kansas City Experiment. Imagine a city plagued by rising crime, with traditional policing strategies proving ineffective. This was Kansas City in the 1970s, where law enforcement implemented a groundbreaking experiment to understand and reduce crime. Instead of spreading police resources evenly, they focused efforts on specific high-crime areas, a strategy informed by the concept of coupling. Gladwell explains that coupling is the idea that certain behaviors, like crimes, are closely tied to specific places and times. The Kansas City experiment revealed that crime isn't randomly distributed at clusters in predictable patterns. For example, specific neighborhoods, streets, or even corners saw repeated incidents of violence, while nearby areas remained relatively safe. By concentrating patrols in high-risk areas, police significantly reduced crime without increasing overall resources. However, Gladwell doesn't shy away from the downsides of this approach. Over-policing certain neighborhoods led to mistrust and tension between law enforcement and communities. This chapter raises critical questions about how society addresses crime. Gladwell argues that while understanding context is vital, solutions must be implemented with care and fairness. The Kansas City experiment shows the power of coupling in shaping behavior, but it also underscores the need for balance between safety and equity. Chapter 11. Sandra Bland and the Miscommunication Trap. In one of the book's most poignant chapters, Gladwell examines the tragic case of Sandra Bland, a young black woman who died in a Texas jail after a routine traffic stop escalated. Gladwell unpacks the series of events that turned a simple encounter into a devastating tragedy, highlighting the role of systemic issues and individual biases. The officer who stopped Bland was following a controversial policing strategy that encouraged frequent stops for minor infractions. This strategy, rooted in the Kansas City experiment, assumed that small interactions could prevent larger crimes. However, it ignored the nuances of human behavior and the importance of context. Bland, who was frustrated but compliant, was treated as a potential threat rather than a citizen expressing legitimate emotion. Gladwell emphasizes how miscommunication played a central role. The officer misread Bland's frustration as defiance, escalating the situation unnecessarily. Bland, in turn, struggled to navigate the officer's aggressive tone. This breakdown in understanding reflects broader societal challenges in interpreting strangers, especially when race, power dynamics, and preconceived notions are involved. This chapter is a powerful critique of systems that prioritize control over connection. Gladwell argues that better training in empathy, communication, and cultural sensitivity could prevent such tragedies. Sandra Bland's story is a heartbreaking reminder of the stakes involved in misunderstanding strangers. Chapter 12. Talking to Strangers. What we've learned. In the final chapter, Gladwell ties together the lessons of the book, challenging us to rethink how we approach strangers. From the CIA's failure to detect Cuban double agents to the tragic death of Sandra Bland, the recurring theme is clear. Our instincts for understanding others are deeply flawed. Gladwell revisits key concepts like default to truth, transparency, and coupling, showing how they intersect in real-world scenarios. For example, our tendency to trust others is essential for building relationships and communities, but it can also blind us to deception, as seen with Larry Nassar. Similarly, our belief in transparency leads us to misjudge those whose behavior doesn't align with our expectations, as in the case of Amanda Knox. But perhaps the most significant lesson is the role of humility. Gladwell argues that much of the harm caused by misunderstanding strangers stems from overconfidence in our ability to read others. By acknowledging our biases and limitations, we can approach interactions with greater curiosity and care. The book ends on a hopeful note. While we may never fully understand strangers, we can improve how we engage with them by asking better questions, seeking context, and listening with empathy. Gladwell challenges us to build a world where these lessons inform not just individual interactions, but also the systems and policies that shape society. Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers is a call to action, a reminder that understanding others requires more than intuition or quick judgments. It demands curiosity, empathy, and a willingness to challenge our assumptions. This book doesn't just shed light on the mistakes we make, it provides a roadmap for doing better. From learning to question our biases to recognizing the role of context, Talking to Strangers equips us with tools to navigate the complexities of human interaction. If this summary resonated with you, we encourage you to read the full book. Gladwell's storytelling and insights offer a depth and nuance that can transform the way you see and engage with others. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking book summaries.